Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. And what we're talking about today is just kind of show you a pattern that's very similar to like using like React or Vue or whatnot, but without using any of those frameworks. It's just essentially a way you can kind of achieve somewhat the same result if you're just doing a really basic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript website. So here I just have a simple index.html and JavaScript file and CSS file all set up. Okay, and again, all this you can find in the repo of all my video content in the video description. So this is going to be in the stateful example folder in that repo. But essentially, I'm going to make it like a div here. We'll just call it a div. Okay, and I'm going to just do some styling. So we'll style that div. Okay, and we'll just say for a div, we want that div to have a width of 80%. We're going to give it a border of 5 pixels dotted brown and margin auto, so that way it centers the div, and then that should be good. Okay, so let me just open this up in live server. Open with live server. So there is our div. You can kind of see the border, and right now, like, you can see like it has no content. So let me give it some height. Nah, we'll just leave it as is. Okay, so what I want to do is just show you kind of how you can change what's inside that div sort of in a stateful way. Now, what do I mean by state? So generally the idea of state is that the idea is you have certain data that your whatever's going on the screen depends on. Like basically, so let's say we just create this object called state. Const state equals, and it's just a JavaScript object. We'll say we have a list of things, which will be an array. Okay, we'll have like my name, which will start out as Alex Merced. Okay, and there we go. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want certain content to be sort of in that div based on this data. Okay, way to do this is we'll create another object. We'll call these our, we'll call it renderer because it renders. Okay, and essentially what this object will have, let's just say like, we'll have one render called initial. We'll just call it like that div because it's just going to be the only one for that div. Okay, so I create a property in this object for that div, and I'm going to make it a function. Okay, and then this function is going to receive the state object. Or actually, yeah, we'll say it receives the state object. So we're expecting that we're going to pass the state to it. Okay, and then what you would do is just have it return and use backticks. So you can use string interpolation, some HTML. So we'll say, initially what it does is that it's going to first it's going to have an h1 that says, list by Alex Merced. Okay, and then afterwards what we're going to do is we're going to use string interpolation. And actually we shouldn't have hard code Alex Merced. We're going to use string interpolation to put Alex Merced in there. So we'll say state.name because we know this is the state object here. Okay, and again, technically I'm referring to this variable. So this variable is not the same exact thing as this because again, when you write a function, you declare the parameter. Okay, if I want to make that a little bit more clear, I can just call this like state argument. So we realize this is a separate variable. But the idea is that whenever I run this function, I'm intending to pass this object as the argument. So this object will become state arg because I'm going to pass that in. You'll see that when we actually do it. Okay, and then I'm going to want to loop through whatever's in the list. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use, and if you're someone who's used React, you're probably going to be very familiar with these patterns. If you're someone who hasn't used React, trying to understand what I'm doing here is going to help you understand React when you learn React later on. Okay, so what I'm going to do is take the state.list, which is an array, and I'm going to use the map method. And I'm going to map through each item in the array. So for each item, I want to return a string with an h3, and inside there is the item. Okay, so I'll just kind of clear out that out. So again, basically what I'm doing is I'm mapping over the array. So I'm going through each item in that array, and then for each array I'm returning an H3. So I'm going to get this array of strings that are H3s, but I don't want to put in an array in the string. You can't really put an array in the string. So then what I'm going to do is after this map is done, I'm going to do a dot join. So that way it just turns that into one big string. So it's just going to turn into one big string of H3s. Okay, and there we go. So what this function is, all its function is doing is just going to create this string and return this string. That's all it does. It returns this string, but this string is built based on the data in my state. Okay, so nice. And we're going to want to render that data where that div is. So what I will do is we'll just say we're going to create a variable that holds the div. So const div equals document.querySelector. Then we're going to select div. So I'm just going to close this for now. Div. So that's going to save the div in this variable. And I'm going to just say initially when this page first loads, div.innerHTML equals, and then I'm going to use that function div or like renderer dot div, and I'm going to pass it the state. Okay, and see now when the page loads, what's going to happen is that this function runs, this returns this HTML string, and that becomes a new inner HTML of the page. Cool. So that's where we're at so far. Okay, so literally all this function is doing is just creating the same string. It's just the only thing that's changing is the state. And you'll see that if I change the state and then I rerun this function, it's going to output different results. Like this is essentially like how a React component works. It's just a function that when given the same state object, okay, and other things like props, but I won't get into that, will churn out different results. So we need to kind of create a way to update the state. So what I'm going to create is like a little input box, input type equals text, and then I'm going to create a button. Okay, add to list. Okay, and yeah, so that's going to be in there. Okay, and then I'm going to style the body so I can just center all these things. Body text align center. So that's going to center everything in the body. So everything is in the body, so everything gets centered. Okay, so now I'm going to create another variable to hold the input box. So const input equals document.querySelector input, and then I'm going to create another to hold the button. Const button equals document.querySelector button. Okay, so now we have all that stuff in a variable. So what I want to do is make it where whenever you click add to list, it's going to take whatever's inside the input box, add it to that array, and then re-update the div. So essentially it's going to look like this. I want to take the button and say add an event listener. Okay, I'm going to say, hey, whenever this button is clicked, what I want to do is the following. I'm going to want to take the data from the input. So we're going to just say like, input text const input text equals div.value. Okay, because we already have that variable div that has div inside of there, and it's actually technically it wouldn't be that, it'd be input.value because it's the input variable that has the input DOM node. And now that I have that in there, what I'm going to want to do is say a state.list.push, and I'm going to push the input value in there. So I'm pushing that into that array. So that way that input is inside the array. And actually, no, I want to do that. I want to do it through input text, or else the last line was useless. There we go. So again, I'm saving the input value inside this variable. I'm then taking that variable and pushing it inside the array. And then I'm going to update the div. I'm going to just say, hey, div.innerHTML equals renderer dot div, and then pass it the state object again. It's the same function. I'm running the same exact function with the same exact argument. The only thing that's going to change is the state, because I'm going to keep pushing things into this array. So let's see if that works. So if I type in cheese, I click add to list, and there we get cheese. And then I add, say I want to add hello. Okay, you see I'm updating the DOM not by running like a whole lot of DOM logic. Basically, I'm just generating the same HTML over and over again through this function. Okay, but yeah. Now let's say I want something else to show up there. Okay, so I can be like, let's create another function, div2. Okay, and again, this we're gonna assume this function will get past the state arg state. So we'll do state arg. And then I'm gonna just return some other HTML saying, hey, this is now what you're looking at. We'll just make this like an H3. Actually, let's do something fun. Let's use a scroll, because those are like old school from the 90s. Hello. This is what is in the div now. Okay. And that's all this function is going to return. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add like, not another button. Let's add an aside. An aside is really just a div. Like an aside, it's just a div. That's all it is. An aside, header, a footer tag. These are all just divs. They just have special names because they're there to help you organize your code. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this aside and I'm going to style it. So the aside tag will be styled with a height of 200 pixels, a width of 200 pixels, okay, a background color of brown. Okay, and so now we see it. Let's center it. So again, it's a block, so we got to center it by doing margin auto, and that'll center the block. Okay, and we'll give it some margin up top, so we'll just say like 20 pixels up and bottom. Right, there we go. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it when you click on this block, it's going to render that other text. So I'm going to create another variable, and this time we're going to call it aside, const aside equals document.query selector aside. Again, aside is just really a div, just by a different name. Okay, so now I have the aside, so I'm going to make it where if we click on the aside, so aside.add event listener. So if you click on the aside, what's going to happen is instead we're going to say div.innerHTML equals renderer. So our renderer has all our different rendering possibilities. Div2, again, that's a function. We pass it the state. Not that it really matters because we don't really use it there. But now watch what happens. So if I click on the block, okay, so now you have, oh, actually it's not scroll. I think it's marquee. Now that I think about it, it's not scroll. It's marquee is the name of the tag. So let me try that again. Yep, there we go. So you see you get the little scroll from, again, harkens back to the 90s. But again, if I go back and I add to the list again, cheese, goes back to the cheese, and I go hello. But if I click on the block, changes the HTML back to this. But again, the state hasn't changed. So even though it erased that HTML that was there before, this array is still building up. So when I add something else to it, like bacon, okay, and I can get the full list. So that's what's nice about this sort of pattern. Okay, you're separating the functions that render what's on the DOM and separating it from the data that the DOM depends on. Okay, so basically every time it's going to run this, it doesn't matter what's in the array. It's just going to loop through that array because it's what the map function is doing. It's looping through this array and creating an H3 for each thing in the array. And then again, when this function runs, it'll render that. Okay, and that's essentially kind of like what React is doing under the hood, except you don't have to do as much setup because React is built to do this kind of thing. And there's a lot of optimizations. But the idea is that this shows you sort of like the thinking through the concept of state, the idea of separating the data that your application depends on versus the actual logic of how you render it to the screen. So these functions here are like your React components, okay, where they basically describe the logic of how you render the data to the screen, like what is the HTML going to look like, but it's taking in the state object that has like the inputs to help generate that HTML string. Okay, and then here I'm just, just imperative logic to trigger these functions. Okay, so hopefully that helps illuminate some things that might be useful in trying to create certain effects that you may want, or help organize your code in a way that kind of squeeze a lot out of one page. That's how you end up with like a single page application. You're just rendering different HTML on the screen at different times, and you have functions like this that just swap out the HTML. So it feels like you're traveling between pages. Like when I click here, it feels like I went somewhere else, but I really didn't. I'm still on the same page. And that's the idea behind a single page application. It's just JavaScript changing what's on the screen instead of you going to different HTML files. So my name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy.